Hey to all Metal Maniacs and welcome to another episode on Iron Horde TV. For those who have been with us during this series of essential albums, we have been going around the world discovering those hidden gems which made up the 80s heavy metal scene of each countries. We started with the new wave of British heavy metal in the UK, then we sailed over to the United States for the power metal coming from that region from mid to late 1980s, back to Europe, Scandinavia, France, Italy, Spain, Germany. We then attacked two countries at the same time last weekend, which are Belgium and Holland, and now we are going to embark on the most daring mission, might I say, because the geographical area we are going to assess is one of the biggest areas of the world. And I'm speaking about the Eastern Bloc, which comprises of the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore nowadays, and 7 satellite states. So it's a big database of bands, most of them unknown, and on this episode I will try and shortlist the albums to 10 essential albums. It wasn't an easy task, but I think you will find this episode very interesting, and actually for those who have not followed so much the music coming from this side of the world, I think you will be plenty surprised at the end of this video. So stay tuned, let's go to the opening theme and straight to the background on this scene, because we need to have a bit of a background, and then straight to the albums I have chosen. Off we go. Thanks for joining us on this video once more. If you are new here, our job is to review albums, suggest bands, review festivals, speak about cultural aspects of heavy metal. So if this is of interest to you, please consider subscribing, liking, sharing this video on social media with your friends in order to reach more metalheads. As I told you in the intro, on this video I'll be speaking and choosing my favorite metal albums from the 80s, from the Eastern Bloc. Throughout the years, speaking with friends and discussions on forums and Facebook groups, I have encountered a number of people who are really into collecting albums from this side of the world. I'm not sure exactly what the fascination sometimes is with regards to these bands coming from the Soviet Union and the rest of the countries under that regime at the time, but they definitely have an interesting background in order to understand from where they're coming from, these bands. So it is important to understand a bit of history of the time in order actually to appreciate the efforts being done by these artists and musicians. Let's keep in mind that as a communist regime, most of these bands were controlled, since heavy metal is seen as a rebellion towards the mainstream society. Most of the authorities had a particular eye of attention towards what these bands were doing. They were kind of controlling what these artists were actually producing. One way of doing this is to only have record labels, recording studios under the total control of the local authorities. In fact, some of the recording labels on here are part of the some kind of ministry, or at least subsidiaries of the government at the time. Another interesting fact is that a number of bands on here have shifted or radically shifted their sound throughout the years. It is known that the local authorities at the time preferred a more softer, a more melodic side to heavy metal. They didn't want to, they didn't want the bands to increase that kind of rebellion within the youth of the time. So most of these bands at the early stages of their career, they didn't produce the kind of sound they really wanted to put forward. So there's bands which started as an AOR band and then shifted to a speed metal band. Bit of a drastic change, so you will understand that there must have been some kind of control initially. Most of the bands had a lot of lineup changes. Obviously it's not easy to pursue these kind of dreams and being constantly kind of monitored to see what you are doing, and not everyone wants to bring that kind of attention towards themselves and their families, of course. And this is what makes, at least from my perspective, these bands so special, in the sense that they still retain that kind of resilience to continue moving onwards in their mission of creating the music they really loved. And in this kind of particular situation, it was more a socio-political situation, but there are other countries where it is more of a religious aspect, where music is censored in a way not to offend the religions of the place. And let's not kid ourselves, because these are situations which are still present nowadays in certain parts of the world. And I take the opportunity with this video to show my solidarity with these metalheads from around the world, from countries where they are persecuted for loving the style of music and being in a band. So I think it should be a mission of each and every metalhead to bring these themes forward and fight them as much as possible. And to the people who are suffering from this, never surrender. Anyways, returning to the situation within the Soviet Union and the satellite states, throughout the years, being also myself having a keen interest in sociology, which is the branch I studied at university, there have been a number of papers throughout the years indicating that heavy metal and rock music could have been a catalyst in overturning the regime. It is interesting to understand how bands and youth at the time used the heavy music in order to send a message that they will not surrender, they will not be used as puppets in the hands of the governments and politicians of the time. And they continued sowing that seed, which eventually would have led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall, slowly and surely, of the Soviet and communist regime. The 80s were a time of indulgence, of excess, of technological advancements, and the youth of the time didn't want to see the West as a threat, but rather as an ally for a better society. And music, in this case heavy metal, has always been at the forefront of these changes in society, the 20th century and up to this day. So this leads me to the albums I chose before the fall of the Iron Curtain, mainly from the 80s, of course, because that is the aim of this series of essential albums, to find the albums from the 80s. And I'm sure that for those who follow this scene, most of these bands are not that obscure, but I am quite sure that for the majority of the listeners and viewers seeing this video, most of these bands will be new to you. So let me tell you that you will be, as I said in the beginning, pleasantly surprised. Just a summary from which countries these albums come from. From the 10 I have chosen, 4 of them are from Russia, 2 of them are from Poland, another 2 from Hungary, 1 from the Czech Republic, which at the time was Czechoslovakia, and 1 from Croatia, which at the time was Yugoslavia. So excuse the kind of long intro, but I think it was pertinent to dedicate a bit of time to understand the background of this metal scene. And also, since most of these albums are in the native language of each countries, and I'm not really that accustomed to speaking in Croatian, Russian, Hungarian, etc., I will try to translate the titles of the tracks which I would like to mention, and even the tracks of the names of the bands, the names of the albums, and so forth. Wherever I didn't find the appropriate translation, I will be indicating with a subtitle here the name of the band or of the album or of the track in question. First album on this list is by the band Citron, released in 1986, and the album title in English is Full of Energy, released with Supraphon Records. This is in fact one of the albums which was released both in the native language and also in English at the same time. I have obviously opted for the English version, but as I always say, if I have to choose my preference with regards to listening to this album, I will always listen to it in its native language. With regards to the sound of this album, what we have here is mostly similar to the band, except the German scene, I think in general throughout most of these albums has a lot of influence, with the exception of a couple, I think, but you will find me referencing Accept often throughout this video. In fact, most of the tracks are up-tempo, heavy metal, with a couple of slower tracks thrown in as usual to slow down a bit the album and maybe attain a bit of more mainstream popularity, I guess. The band of the 80s, most of them had this mix of slower to faster tracks. It is also a very melodic album, a very catchy record as well. It has a good production. Vocals are a mix of a clean approach and in some parts also a bit of a rougher approach, but nothing extreme. Very, as I said, catchy music on here, so you will immediately appreciate the music on offer on this album. Check out also the label on here, the record label, because they have other great Czechoslovak bands signed with them and albums released with this label, so it's a source of good music. My favorite track on this record is Heart of Steel, which starts with an accordion playing. You start asking yourself if this really is a heavy metal album, but then immediately the riff comes in and your doubts are really thrown out of the window, as they say. So it really reminds me of the opening to the album Restless and Wild by Accept on the track Fast as a Shark. The next album I chose is from a band from what is nowadays Bosnia and also from Croatia. I mean, apparently they started in Bosnia, but then they moved to Croatia. At the time it was Yugoslavia. The name of the band is Divilje Jagode and the name of the album is Karobniaci, released in 1983 with Diskoton Records. Basically, I hope first of all I said the names correctly. My Croatian friends can correct me. Basically, the name of the band translates to Wild Strawberries and the name of the album translates to Wizards. This is regarded as the first Yugoslav heavy metal band ever. Actually, this album is their fourth record, released in 1983, so they started quite early with their music, but this was the first album I ever heard from this band, and they have other good albums, but I think if I had to choose one, it would be this one, and I think it was a bit heavier as well, although what you have here is a mix of Led Zeppelin, 80s Scorpions, AC/DC as well, so there's a kind of a mix of heavy metal and hard rock, but it is a heavy album nonetheless. Again, it's a very catchy record. Also, I think in certain parts you can hear the influence of the new wave of British heavy metal as well. I love the vocals on here. Again, a mix of higher pitch vocals and vocals in the lower register as well, so a very flexible type of singer, and I think the vocalist here is possibly most talented out of these 10 albums. When I say talented, I mean as a natural talent, because all of these records have great vocalists, but I think gives me the impression that this vocalist is one of those naturally talented vocalists. There are some great guitar solos included in this record, and an interesting fact is that it was recorded in Germany, and it was not common in those times for a band within these states to record outside of the country. And it shows really the level of production on this record, really, for 1983 especially. It is really good. Anyways, another essential albums as far as I'm concerned. If I have to choose a favorite track, it would be Metalni Radnici, which translates more or less to metal workers. Next in line is the first album from Hungary, released in 1988 by the band Lord, and the album title is Szemedben a Csillagok, which roughly translates to The Stars in Your Eyes. I hope again I pronounce that properly. If not, please correct me. I would appreciate that a lot. This is a band I discovered some years ago whilst searching for another band named Lord, which is an American band, an 80s band. I was searching for the album The Second Coming. This band popped up on my search, and so I said, sure, why not? Let me see what this is all about. It was quite different from what I'm searching, and in fact I think I can categorize this album as the odd one on the list, since it is a very melodic record. Yet it has those heavy riffs at times and beautiful guitar solos, very emotional. You can kind of feel, I mean, anyone who's into this kind of music knows to what I'm referring about when you hear that kind of solos full of emotions. Anyways, I liked this record especially. They have another record after this which is also very good, titled Ragadozok, but I prefer to go for this one because it's the first one I discovered from this band. And it actually released in the late stages of the 1980s, so it fit more to the concept of this video. When I said that this is the odd album, I mean it in a positive way, because it is an album heavily influenced by the 80s synth. If I had to describe their sound, it would be kind of a mix of Scorpions and Dio, but more heavily influenced by the keyboards. In fact, the keyboards and the lead guitars on this record are the highlights as far as I'm concerned. The interaction between the two is done so good. Vocals are on the thinner side at certain stages. I sometimes think it's actually a female singing, but I think again it fit the music really well. It is a great package. They have a big following in Hungary, and since I have been also researching a bit more deeper into these bands, you can see that they have a big following in their own countries, yet they are barely known outside of those borders. And this is mostly, with the exception I think of a couple maybe, but not even, maybe one, the last band I will mention on this video, which can be regarded as being known outside of their own country. But I think the rest of these bands, with a few exceptions, have a great accomplishment in their own country, but surprisingly enough, barely known outside. So if I had to choose a favorite track from here, it would be the closing track, Vandor, which translates to Wanderer, and it's almost kind of epic as well in its approach. The feel within the guitar solos again is so good. Next is the second album from Hungary, and this is possibly the first album which is totally 100% heavy metal. And I'm speaking about the album titled Totalis Metal by the band Pokolgep, released in 1986 with Start Records. As I said, outright 100% heavy metal with no frills, no gimmicks, no beating around the bush, so to speak. And I think this band is kind of a cult band in the underground scene, and kind of also a bit known outside of the borders of Hungary, but yet only to those kind of heavy metal nerds. This is their debut record, and in fact you can hear them, even the production is not so good, but you can hear those aggressive touches which will increase in their later releases. The music here reminds me often to the band Iron Maiden, especially from the Anno era, that kind of rough approach. There's a lot of influences from the German metal scene and also from Judas Priest, so you kind of get the idea of what kind of sound you're expecting over in this album. And I think this is the greatness of this record, that it captures so well the spirit of 80s heavy metal, that old school heavy metal that I so love myself, and I'm sure most of you who are watching this video love as well. The vocals sometimes have that kind of a strange tone to them which you need to get accustomed a bit, but as a whole they really fit the record again, and I think the vocalist does a pretty good job on this record. If I had to choose a favorite track on here, it would be Mint Halalig Rock and Roll, which is translated rock and roll to death, and obviously I cannot but agree with that. Onwards to the next country and the next album, which is from the band Turbo, the album titled Dorosle Dzieci, released in 1983 with Polton Records. Dorosle Dzieci, which translates to adult children. This is another classic record, the debut album by this band, a band which would eventually move towards a more thrashy sound in their career, but this one is a bit more into classic heavy metal territory. Apparently this album, as soon as it was released, sold around 113,000 copies. If this is true, I mean, it's a great feat with a sound that isn't exactly mainstream. I think it shows how much the people at the time really were craving this kind of aggressive outlet, which possibly they didn't have during their everyday life. And if I may delve a bit deeper into this, I think metal in general really gives all of us an outlet to shed that kind of aggressivity and the stress we accumulate because of work and everyday problems. And I think people at the time were so much controlled, they were so much limited, that whenever they got the possibility, such as listening to this kind of music and feeling as part of that rage coming out of those notes, I think it was for them kind of liberating. That's why this kind of style of music, and any style in general, but especially heavy metal, is important in a society, because it gives each and every one of us the chance of expressing this kind of aggressivity in a peaceful, so to speak, way. Obviously, mosh pits and stuff aren't so peaceful, but it is a more controlled environment. As I said, this is more of a classic heavy metal style album, but that doesn't mean there aren't faster parts which show us the way the band was heading towards, and the vocals remind me a lot of Rob Halford, especially the higher screams, really similar to Rob Halford. Certain parts on the album here remind me also of Thundersteel era Riot. Production is quite good, even though apparently this was recorded in a radio station in Szczecin, Poland, obviously. Yes, you can hear also the bass sound as well, and which is something I really look forward to in any heavy metal album. If I had to choose my favorite track on here, it would be Szalony Ikar, which translated in English is Med Icarus. Next album from Poland is possibly the roughest one on the list. I'm speaking about the album 666 by the band Cat, released in 1986 with Polmark Records. This is one of the albums as well that was released both in Polish and in the English language. The title of the English album would be Metal and Hell. Add that to the fact that the name of this band, Cat, translated in English means executioner, and executioner 666, Metal and Hell. You can understand what kind of music you are going to face over here, and it's much more than classic heavy metal. Basically, this music reminds you of the band Venom, with its rougher edge, as I said, a more grittier approach to heavy metal. What we have here is speed metal full of darkness and energy. I guess if this record would have been released in Russia, I think there would have been some problems with the band, but apparently states like Poland and other areas which weren't exactly part of the Soviet Union, but rather satellite states like Poland was, they were a bit more liberal, as much as liberal can be in a communist state. But thankfully this album was given possibly the go-ahead to be released, and thankfully for that, because it is a great album full of, as I said, energy, violence, and it really epitomizes that old school metal sound so perfectly. Vocals are raw and menacing. Many times they remind me of Martin Valkyr from Sabbath. Production really sounds as it was on a budget, because it's not that good. I mean, it is good for this album because it gives it that menacing, darker feel, but from a sound engineering perspective, there is a lot to be desired. But I think if it would have been cleaner, it would have hurt the overall feel of this record. Therefore, if Venom, Merciful Fate, Sodom is your thing and you have never listened to this album, then move your ass and search for this record, because you will be very pleasantly surprised. Favorite track on here would be Vyrochnia, which translated in English would be Oracle. Now we have arrived to the last 4 albums, and these 4 albums are all of them from Russia. 3 out of these 4 records are with a particular record label titled Melodia Records, and it is interesting to know that this record label was part of the Ministry of Culture of the time. Basically, 3 out of these 4 albums that were issued by this record label, you can understand that they were monitored to see what kind of music they were and lyrics they were putting out. The other record which was not released with this record label is the last album that I will mention on this list, from a band which I think is the most popular out of this lot of bands. So onwards to the first album from Russia, and it is by the band Magnit. The album title is The Aziria, released in 1988 by Melodia Records. You know you are a Russian band when you have the image of Stalin on the cover, right? I mean, as soon as I saw the cover of this record, even though the name really uncovers that they are at least a Soviet Union band, but you immediately understand that this band is from that area of the world. Considering the title of the album, which the Azerian Latin in English means seize the day, and the dark kind of gloomy atmosphere of this record, I think kind of expresses the mood of the people at the time in that region of the world. It's like the music is in itself, without discussing the lyrics, it's like a means of protest. The second track on this record, which is titled We Exist Without Feeling Our Land Underneath, this is a translated obviously title, but it really kind of gives you a lot of food for thought just with the title of that track. Add to that the track is kind of has touches of epic doom metal in it, although this is a heavy metal album with faster parts throughout most of it, but the heaviness on this track is with that title is pretty good, strong message. Even though most of the tracks on this list and on most of the lists, even from other countries, I say it's a catchy album. This album is the opposite of catchy. I mean, you have to listen to it a number of times to really grasp the essence of this record. If you listen to it once, you might say, what's special about this? Or this is really, is it a joke or whatever? At least that's kind of the approach I got from the first listens on this record. But then once you start understanding the twisted nature of some of these tracks, it really is a very powerful album. In fact, it was very difficult for me to mention similar bands to this record, and in fact I'm not going to mention any because I don't find this kind of sound in any other bands around the world. I think it's a very Soviet Union sound, if I might say that. Anyways, there are faster tracks like Work, Memorandum and Keep the Fire. They are verging on speed metal to a certain extent. Check out the nice keyboard solo on the track that I already mentioned, Memorandum, but if I had to choose my favorite track on this record, it would be Eleonora. Before I move on to the next album, something which I remember just now, and I think the overall weirdness of this record is accentuated by that kind of fuzzy guitar sound throughout this record. Yes, I think this is a special album and something you will need to give, as I said, particular attention to and not rush through it. Next album on this list is by the band Avgust, the album titled Demon, released in 1987 with Melodia Records. An album that starts with the sound of bells. I am immediately sold because I really love the sound of bells in heavy metal, the intros and the interludes. I've always thought about the sound of the bell as really a dark and menacing kind of. An odd fact about this record is that the first track is sung by a different vocalist compared to the rest of the tracks on this record. I'm not sure if he was a guest on this album, but on the follow-up record to this one, the same vocalist is also the vocalist in one of the tracks of that records as well. I'm not sure, maybe he only offers his services for only one track. And this particular first track from this record, which is the title track Demon, is one of the best tracks actually on this record. It's a bit different than the rest of the tracks. This one is a more aggressive track, and even the vocals seem to be more aggressive, although the rest of the album is a really clean melodic kind of sounding album. Sometimes remind me of Whitesnake as well, that kind of 80s mainstream metal that was so popular at the time. But this first track is more aggressive, quite different than the rest of the album. In fact, the production is very clean, the distortion is to a minimal, so to speak. Even the drums can be barely heard at times. And this might be the fact that authorities from the time maybe were involved in keeping the sound of this record more towards a softer touch. But since the overall feel of this album is a melodic album, it doesn't really hurt the overall experience, and I think for what it is, this is a really good album and one of those catchy albums that you will want to hear over and over again. There are some faster parts on tracks like The Night and Danger. It's thought that on the track The Night there are fake applauses included in it. It's an odd thing, but both of the tracks are really good. Those tracks that are more similar to Whitesnake are My Head Aches So Bad and You Be the Judge. So if Whitesnake is one of your favorite bands, then go check out those two tracks before checking the rest of the album. And returning to my love of bells in heavy metal, coincidentally my favorite track on this album is titled The Bell. Next album on this list, and this is probably the first album I've heard from all the albums I have mentioned on this list, and it's by the band Kruiz. The album title is Kruiz 1, released in 1987 with Melodia Records. This band has had numerous lineup changes. They started in 1979 as an AOR band, but they were pressured by authorities to disband, especially because it seems of their dislike of one of the members in this band, Alexander Monin. After a while they got back together without Monin, but they again disbanded after a short time, only to reunite back together with some changes again in the lineup. But now they started playing speed metal and not AOR and melodic metal music anymore. And this is the first album with that lineup and with that style of heavy metal. The greatness of this album is that it is not just speed metal just for the sake of being fast, but the tracks are composed so well and they are so interesting, each one of them. The differences from one track to the other are so evident, yet the essence of the music is there from start to finish. The guitar solos are a highlight on this album, with the riffing on this record and the addition of those great guitar solos and melody. They are such a great combination together. This band reminds me a lot of Judas Priest, 80s Judas Priest, Exciter, ADX, just these great speed metal bands that have made such a big impact on heavy metal. And I think Kruiz on this album and even the follow-up album to this one need to be mentioned with the likes of these bands because they are such great albums. The only track on here which is a bit slower to the rest is titled So Come With Us. It's a 10-minute track and it starts with a long intro, and it is, I mean, it's not easy to describe in words, but it's a mid-tempo masterpiece. But all in all, I think the best of Kruiz is in the faster tracks. The opening track titled Intro, Distant Light, the track Mirage, all speed metal anthems as far as I'm concerned. Although my favorite track on here is The Last Dawn, which starts with very sad, melancholic lead guitar, but then blasts onward with that synonymous speed metal riffing which will leave you breathless. In fact, the band have done also an official video to this track, which I'm going to link in the description below. So we have arrived to the last album on this list. As I told you, this is possibly the most famous band out of all these bands I have mentioned on this list, and possibly the most famous band from the Eastern Bloc, and I'm speaking about the band Arya and their debut album Megalomania, released in 1985. It was a self-released album, and apparently this album was recorded in a makeshift studio in a garage of one of the band members, so the production is not really that good on here, yet it doesn't harm so much the overall brilliance that we find on this record. Basically, Arya are renowned as the Russian Iron Maiden, and I think that pretty much describes what kind of music you will get to hear from this band. It is a band that's still going strong 35 years after they were founded. As I said, like most 80s heavy metal band, that lack of budget for a production really then accentuates certain styles associated with old school heavy metal. Although influenced by Iron Maiden, but there are influence also from other styles of heavy metal, such as the faster speed metal track almost Torero, the more mid-tempo tracks like Tusks of Black Roots and Live for Free, and what could be regarded as the first epic metal track from the Eastern Bloc, the track titled Volunteer. With its haunting sounds, keyboard sounds in the background, it really creates that majestic feel, that grand feel that good epic metal tracks really transmit. The ballad on this record is the track Dreams. It's also a very good track, the usual ballad that every self-respecting 80s heavy metal album should have. The ending track, America is Behind, really reminds me of 80s Scorpions. The title of the track is a bit of political propaganda as well. Maybe they used that title to bring to them some positive attention from the authorities in order not to be hassled with their music, who knows. Favorite track on this record is the faster, as I already mentioned, the faster track Torero. So those are all the records I had for you for this episode, an episode that I have been long thinking of doing, but due to the big number of bands involved in this scene, obviously we're incorporating here a population of millions and millions of people, I really was finding it difficult to narrow it down to 10 albums, and I still do find it difficult, but at a certain point in time I cut a line basically and I decided on these 10 records. This is obviously kind of a special episode in the sense that this music was born and raised in a society where this kind of style was really frowned upon, which makes, I think, at least from my perspective, everything a bit more special. So I advise everyone that has listened to these 10 albums to keep on searching for other records from this scene. It's very easy to find information. You just type heavy metal from the Eastern Bloc and you'll have a never-ending list of bands and albums to listen to. So not much more for me to add. Check out the links in the description. You'll find affiliate links to the records, and if you click on them and you purchase the record or anything else from that link, we will get a small commission to no extra expense for you, which will help us run this channel. Before closing though, me invite you again, if you haven't done so yet, to subscribe to this channel. Most of the viewers of these videos are not subscribed, so if we get those subscriptions, it will help us grow and maybe in the future give a better service to you and the whole of the metalhead community. So subscribe, like the video, share it, click on the bell so you are notified when we post new videos every Wednesday and Saturday. There's nothing for me more to add. Stay safe and metal on. Cheers.